Hello everyone, this is Mili Saha. I'm from Bangladesh. I'm an associate professor of English at Jagannath University here. As you know, my today's presentation topic is bi or multilingual learners, linguistic marginalization in schools, Bangladeshi indigenous students narratives. So to introduce my research, I want to talk a bit about the context, like Bangali or Bengali is the majority ethnic and linguistic group consisting of 98% population in the country, where Bangla as a national language may create learning and communication issues in the 54 indigenous groups, as the literature shows. But this is obvious, it happens, and Bangla is still the principal and mandatory instructional language in all government schools, colleges, and universities, even in the minority concentrated Chittagong Hill Tracts regions for many reasons, including teachers' language deficiency and inadequate training. Most of the mainstream schools implement the monolingual ideology of using Bangla as the dominant medium of instruction and restrict indigenous languages in education. So, as it is in like other countries or context, so the ethnic minority children living in the remote areas or having little or no experience of using Bangla suffer from language disadvantage at the elementary levels in school while they start learning in Bangla for the first time. Besides, they have to use Bangla often to integrate with mainstream society, which creates a struggle of maintaining their community languages and indigenous identity. Such compulsory dominant language socialization results in the culture and language losses of the ethnic minorities, as the literature shows, and it happens in Vietnam, hence ensuring the inclusion of indigenous children in mainstream education through mother tongue based multilingual education is a major challenge in the current circumstances. And it's also needed to save those languages from being lost or from being died. So the theories that support my research are social inclusion and social exclusion of the marginalized people. So marginalizing local and indigenous languages results in excluding the major population from participating in the national discourses, and social inclusion and exclusion are usually described to refer to the amount of success, access, and engagement the individuals or groups in a community have from all aspects of life. So, social exclusion is a process through which individuals or groups wholly or partially lose their identities, such as age, gender, race, ethnicity, culture, or language, or physical, economic, or social disadvantages. Social exclusion often results from a process involving poverty, lack of amenities, or human rights violation, and so on. So, socially excluded population may be deprived of their social voice, recognition, or capacity to actively represent in politics or community. And socially excluded people often include women, ethnic and religious minorities, or migrants deprived of either political or human rights. So, the participants that I'm referring to, the indigenous group living in Bangladesh named Chakma. um, they really have this all the features of social exclusion, since they, although they do have some political rights or voting rights, but definitely they have less recognition or social acceptance, and their voices are not heard, and their capacities are often ignored. So the notion of social inclusion is understood as a reverse condition of exclusion, which might lead to social integration. So let's see if they do have this. Social inclusion is naturally a multifaceted and complex phenomenon, which is useful indicators of a national development. It also indicates the development on a group level within a nation from three perspectives: a long and healthy life expectancy that my participant group has, because they do have very good food habit and a healthy lifestyle. But access to knowledge as measured by the adult literacy rate, that's definitely very low, and gross enrollment ratio in primary, secondary, and tertiary education is quite limited. So a decent standard of living as measured by GDP is um, far away because they cannot even sometimes provide with the basic needs like food, clothes, and other amenities that they need or treatment. So the term aims at comprising strong employment, economic reform, and social cohesion as part of a knowledge-based economy. Social exclusion, on the other hand, narrowly means the economic unwell-being, underemployment, and the absence of civil or social rights, especially to healthcare and education. And usually, the indigenous groups in all the countries, as I read or I know, is they are really deprived of that necessary healthcare and education. Multilingual interstices suggest ideal models of language use across differently valued discursive zones at schools, and including unofficial linguistic resources in a specific discursive context implies the exclusion of other, the more important ones. And these things happens with the indigenous groups I'm talking about, because their mother tongue, the first language, is discarded in school, and definitely they have to prioritize the second language, and that definitely creates challenges in managing learning and the social communications. So why did I choose this research? Um, the aspect of Bangla as a national language and English as a priority second language in the country definitely create learning and communication difficulties in those 54 indigenous groups and their multilingual practices in academic and social interactions in monolingual context like Bangladesh. So the other personal attachment to the research is that I have a number of indigenous friends, students whom I closely observe with all their linguistic activities and behaviors. And I have my neighbors too. We are sharing a building and living in the same building with two indigenous families. So they're very close to me, and I have much understanding with them. So, so observing them from a very close position and relationships definitely made me interested to work on their linguistic positions or social identity, the way they perceive or the way they practice. So the challenges involved in the multilingual language in education policy for these linguistic minority groups, comprising only 2% of the total population, have been discussed in Rahman's study. And that was done in 2010, a old one and not empirical one. It was only literature review. So no studies have examined how the language minority groups negotiate their language and socio-cultural identities against the monolingual Bengali community, neither how they confront the discriminative multilingual academic and socio-cultural milieu has been explored. So my research questions include: what are the linguistic behaviors of the bi or multilingual indigenous students in academic and social interactions in Bangladesh, and how do they perceive the social exclusion and inclusion resulted from marginalizing the first language in the local language in education policies? How do these perceptions impact their learning and performance as well? So to develop my research, I used a qualitative research method to elicit the students' perceptions, and as a tool, I used semi-structured interview, and the interviews were taken online and recorded so that I can analyze data later. And the participants included five high school Chakma students living in the Chittagong Hill Tracts area. And just to introduce the indigenous group named Chakma, is the largest indigenous group in the country, and they are the majority group among all other indigenous communities, and they are believed to be advanced with education and other development in comparison with the other indigenous groups or small groups. So the data were analyzed thematically using content analysis. Let's look at the findings. So what the first respondent says: from his childhood, his parents tried hard to teach him Bangla, so he did well in school. So this is a learning over the learning. I was good in Bangla, but many of my classmates could not learn the language well since their parents could not provide support or tuition. It also discriminates based on low family income and parents' education, as it happens with learning any second language. So, parents' financial capability is crucial factor in deciding whether your child will do well in in the school or in examinations. How could you support their second language acquisition or learning? So their learning mainly centers on acquiring the language, even throughout the school. So some of the teachers make us everything understand and explain repeatedly, but some others are impatient. My classmates often sneer at me when I ask for frequent explanations. The exam is always a challenge. I can recognize all questions given from the text, although understanding the creative questions and answering instructions is difficult. Hence, I cannot respond well. The respondent shares an odd experience with me. He said once I could not understand a Bangla word and asked the teacher twice. He beat me to the bone for this. I was so scared that I have never tried hard to learn in the classroom since then. So this is inhuman. Such cruelty and discriminations demotivate us to learn the language and generate negative attitudes towards the language or the community. We compensate the knowledge and language gaps by ourselves with parental help at home. But it's not that everyone can manage getting parental help or everyone can manage understanding by themselves. So there is a gap that they experience. In between schools learning and home learning. So also the assessments are unequal on the language competence issue. All of us are anxious about performing in exams in all subjects, especially in Bangla grammar. Those who speak Bangla achieve much better than us, and we're always lagged. If we studied in Chakma, I would compete equally. So they believe this is an unequal competition since they have to uh, give more effort to learn the language alongside learning the subjects, but the Bengali peers or students do not need to do that. They better give more effort to learn English. So in that sense, the indigenous students are quite less proficient in English as well. So the second respondent says usually the Chakma students confront the listening issues at the elementary level, although the instant linguistic discriminations are experienced mainly at the junior level. Now I'm in class 6, as she said. I do not face many difficulties. I had severe problems in understanding, reading, or writing in my elementary school. I would not understand and request my Chakma teachers to explain the lessons in the Chakma language. I was scared my Bengali friends who understand everything better than me would do better in exams. I would feel insecure and vulnerable thinking about my performance. I'm still so. So this really never goes off. And however, they usually start to understand Bangla well from the fourth grade. Still, they always feel anxious about studying in Bangla because the language is never acquired in a natural way. So the school would be great if everyone, including my teachers and friends, would speak Chakma and books were written in that language too. Although I'm good at Bangla studies now, I do not feel all right in school. I would understand everything quickly and not need to think much before responding or preparing for that. Still, I have some difficulties in writing. I'm not so quick like others and hence different. So the difference is obvious, and definitely they understand that they are not equally competent in that language, and as consequently in the subject matters or in English. Um, uh, Equally with like their peers, especially the Bengali peers. So these indigenous students use Bangla for reading and learning only, not for querying with teachers or chatting with friends. As she said, we widely use Chakma language. It is not a problem. If the books were in Chakma, it would look equal and I would feel included there. It is still challenging to manage everything in Bangla. So the language is the the big issue to create the differences, and they feel discriminated from different aspects. At the very beginning it is weird, as a third respondent says, when we cannot they cannot speak well, do not understand the explanation and have pronunciation issues. This is really challenging, but the teachers and others cooperate. So that's a supporting point. I would think, why should they speak and teach in Bangla? I had been talking and learning in Chakma. What about my first language? Why do they not teach me in my mother tongue? It was really struggling. I felt excluded from almost everything. To be precise, I would feel separated and denied from the easy access to the information and the institution. I would feel like foreigners often. So this is a complete separation and complete exclusion because you cannot read well, or you cannot listen well, or you cannot understand well. So you have limited access to information and everything. So they have options to trans language to Chakma in Chittagong area. But after coming out from the hill tracts area for higher education or other transfer purposes, translanguaging becomes challenging, and it is a pressure to cope with the odd questions and continue with pure Bangla. What they have to do outside the Chittagong hill tracts area. So no one translates things into us to us here. At first, it is threatening to study everything in a second language. I would read aloud to improve my Bangla speaking skills, and I'm always insecure or confused about my overall learning potential for language incompetence compared to my Bengali friends. And I often repeatedly ask for clarifications, which makes me more vulnerable than others and creates outsider feelings. So there is an excluded feelings when they are even mixing or communicating with the mainstream community. So the fourth respondent said before going to school, they already need to develop the second language communicative competence, which is an extra learning responsibility. Most of them acquire half of the required competence in Bangla, since many elementary teachers are Chakma and help with Chakma explanations. It is good to study inside Chittagong areas. So, as he said, while talking to the teachers and peers for even other social purposes, I have to be much alert to perform well and correctly. However, most of the time I mix Chakma course and it creates confusions. So this is stressful and anxiety provoking. They have to be allowed whether my friends understand me, my teachers understand me, whether I'm correctly speaking, or whether I really sound like Bengali or not. So she likes translanguaging, Bangla, or multilingualism. But if there was no linguistic discrimination, or Chakma was the first working language, so it would be great with no hassle of learning a second language. So before going to school, I used to speak in Chakma at home, although I had to use Bangla to the teachers inside the class and Chakma outside. After school period, we translanguage and mix course with the community people. So you see, they do have many choices of language, and they have to use different languages for different communications and different purposes. Uh, that's definitely challenging because it's not that you can do this appropriately every time. So they are compelled to learn switching accurately to maintain the social and academic communications and relations. As the respondent said, in spite of everything, I always want to be a part of the mainstream community. We need social integration to be included, learn about the country, and adapt the culture. We want access to the Bengali community, but we are often forced to be excluded in many ways. So it's many ways through language, culture, look, manners, um, and perceptions. So they cannot be accommodated in the mainstream as a society or community. So the last respondent said at the very beginning of his school, it is really odd with all language issues. The teachers often cooperate. Students have options to translanguage from Bangla to Chakma in the local schools, but translanguaging is restricted in the other areas. And during harassments or abuses at this stage is an extra pressure in addition to acculturation in the areas outside Chittagong. When they come for higher education, so definitely they have an extra pressure of adapting with the community that they never feel that very close or intimate, and the whole community is quite unknown to them. So as the respondent said, peers often question my translanguaging and course switching, which sounds discriminating. Like they say, "What do you say? We do not understand." So might be there is some nuance, and I have been habituated now. I understand they do not know our language and culture. That is why I do not react, but I feel bad since this exclusion is defenseless. It alerts me about my difference. The difference is obvious and it's felt. The exclusion is experienced, although they try hard to be included. Even peers are not empathetic, instead harassing sometimes. So many students in my schools in Dhaka the capital city, shouts at us and harasses by calling Chinese, Korean, or Rohingya for different look. So this is extremely disheartening. Even we are always underestimated and outsmarted in everything, as if we do not belong to the country. So this is really disheartening. The little school girl was telling, "We do not belong to this country. This is not our country. We're just staying here," and it's really made me feel so bad. So they enjoy very limited rights and free access to everything while already confront various challenges in studies. So as the girl said, we have always had a weak basic, and we are never confident and sociolinguistically included. That separation makes us feeling incompetent, having minor share in knowledge. With a different look and language, we are always excluded from the mainstream academia. We are never accepted even we do well in study. So there is a discrimination, exclusion, and harassment, abuse, and trying hard to get into the community, or struggle of being a Bengali and holding the national identity besides the community identity. So there are struggles, and that is a lifelong one, as we say. And I asked them if they have any recommendation or suggestions to improve the situation, or to make the circumstances more inclusive. So they said extremely negative attitudes and abusive interferences often turn diversity exclusion prominent, and underestimating language competence obstructs inclusion. It is not the language status, rather the linguistic abuses, discriminations, and othering should be resolved. So this is the teacher educator's responsibility to introduce languagism in the elementary level curricula and raise awareness against such discriminations, or such abuses on the language ground. So I take it really very seriously. And secondly, they said multilingualism and translingualism help to avail more opportunities, and they do need transformative bilingualism through immersion from the elementary level as it is now, since they need to learn Bangla at the same time as soon as possible, so they can be integrated with the mainstream society and education or employment and everything. So however, they need more Chakma teachers who will understand their problems and use both Bangla and Chakma to teach. That's a very good point. And thirdly, they say they should practice more Bangla to be proficient enough to involve themselves with the mainstream community and avail opportunities with jobs or studies. Hence, despite all barriers, if they would learn in the mother tongue using Chakma books and instructions, they could perform their best. So they are always aware about their rights, that they need to learn in their mother tongue, and then the learning could be permanent and in depth. Uh, Fourthly, they said even the Chakma teachers need training to transform the pedagogies and use appropriate instructional language, because they do have responsibilities of teaching both the language and the content, including translanguaging to ensure the learner's L2 acquisition and learning at the same time. So they need their mother tongue for learning, and they need Bangla for L2 acquisition opportunities. So definitely teachers have some crucial and critical role, and only the Chakma teachers can play the required roles at elementary level, and that is why the authorities, the government, they need to rethink the teacher recruitment policies. And to conclude the research, I just find some comparison and a correlation with the international findings, the existing literatures. So students' daily natural practices of translanguaging in lessons and other socio-communicative activities in and outside the school reinforce their sense of identity and solidarity along with the interpersonal growth. So they believe in growing themselves as a Bengali citizen, and at the same time they have to keep and maintain their cultural identity and cultural resources. So translanguaging is also used as a pedagogical approach, engaging the ethnic students to exploit emergent academic or social languages. Their multilingual repertoire is utilized for learning and identity formation naturally in the multicultural and multilingual communities. So we need to further study these complex and changing linguistic activities of the indigenous groups and recognize their unheard voices, suggesting any policy intervention required to ensure inclusive academic and social integration. And the limitation of my research that I should mention, that I was dealing with the only one single indigenous group named Chakma, but I could compare with the other groups finding like Marma or Manipuri or Garo. So and in future I wish to extend the research to find to get the similar perceptions from other community students and compare the findings and see the differences. So that's all from me today, and these are the references that I used for my research. Thank you everyone for hearing me. Thanks for your time. If you have any questions, you can forward this via the following emails, and the photos that I used in my slides are taken from the UNDP and UNESCO websites. Thanks everyone.